Hello and welcome to the Freedom Anarchist News Review. Back again after a week's hiatus. With me tonight, I have Andy Minker. Um,
Hello.
and we have, what have we got on the list this week? We have prescription, obviously, the 532 arrests over the weekend, with many detainees saying straightforwardly they were ignoring warnings not to do it again. Um, we've got asylum hotels, and in the rush to close them, a possible homelessness crisis in the offing, which is always fun. There are planning changes which are being made primarily to help Heathrow, and Yvette Cooper's big project for growth. We have policing and the basically offloading of the responsibility to tell people what the ethnicity of a criminal or alleged criminal might be to top cops, which could possibly go wrong. We have potentially Europe on fire, and I think that should be all of them. So, starting with the big story of the week, certainly for anarchists, I think the crisis of prescription, and specifically what went on at the weekend, and how it's all panning out with the Defend Our Juries thing. Andy, what are your thoughts on that?
Okay, so we have, as you say, 532 arrests, of which 521 are people involved in the Defend Our Juries action, and then there's 11 for other things. Um, One for uh, the Section 13 offence, which it appears everyone has been arrested under. And this is the offence of having an item or wearing an item that could arouse reasonable suspicion that you are supportive of a prescribed organisation. Um, Now, that's incredibly wide. It's what's called an offence of strict liability. So it's not your intention that matters. It's the fact of whether it could. It's reckless. Now, obviously, if you were putting up a poster that said something like physical resistance, then you would be able to argue in court that you were disassociating yourself from a peaceful organisation like Palestine Action, and you'd be in the clear. Um, Whereas
Pretty
almost anything
ridiculous.
else that you say could potentially, given and depending on the circumstances, to amount to supporting Palestine Action. Because if you say, I support a two-state solution, um, people might say, whoa, well, you can't have two states while the IDF is stopping the Palestinians having a state. And therefore, you're supporting damaging Elbit, supplying with them weapons. So you are, in fact, backing Palestine Action. It's relatively ludicrous law, but it worked when the terrorist organizations were incredibly small, and therefore you're only targeting a few people. So we've had some over the years some very what we would call iffy convictions of people who've been associated with Islamist groups, um, but everyone let it go because it was only against a small targeted minority, and it was used generally to suppress political debate within the Muslim community in this country. Now, whoa, we see where it goes. Now, this is a little bit short of the British on London record of 1,314 arrests in one day, which was for a committee of 100 demonstration against nuclear weapons in 1961. And since we've still got nuclear weapons, you can see that the amount of arrests does not always correlate to the success of your campaign. Um, Interestingly, some people were comparing it to the poll tax in 1990, of which there were 341 arrests on the day, and there was no poll tax very shortly thereafter. So it's not just the number of arrests, it's also the way that they happen. Um, One interesting thing with the poll tax, of course, is that there are about another 150 arrests subsequently. Um, and what remains to be seen, of course, is that vast numbers of people have expressed support for Palestine actions, pointed out on social media, etc., and we see if they get arrested. We see who gets charged, and all of that. I think it's relatively pointless to speculate until it happens. Almost everyone is on bail until the end of October, while the Crown Prosecution Service shuffles the paperwork, and all prosecutions under the Terrorism Act have to have the approval of the Director of Public Prosecutions. And in cases where it affects British international relations, which this done does, the Attorney General. So it's not just a bureaucratic process by the CPS. The government gets to stick their oar in on whether prosecutions happen. Defend Our Juries say they'll be back on the 6th of September to do the same thing if they can get 1,000 people to do it. The strategy of the man who broke the bank at Monte Carlo, that you just double your stakes each time you bet until you win, which
I
I
admire
guess
the ambition.
100% convinced of. For another thing for us old anarchists, that does fall in the build-up week for the Dicey Arms Fair, and I wish they'd done it down in Docklands to try and link up with what we're actually about here, which is stopping the arms being exported. So that's a little bit of a shame, but you've got to admire them. I'm reminded of that wonderful quote after the charge of the Light Brigade, where Lord Raglan addresses the survivors and says, "It's a mad brain trick, men, but it was none of my doing." For one of the troopers to turn around and says, "Never mind, my lord, we're ready to go again." So yeah, we shall see what happens, and yeah, it's a little bit up in the air.
I mean, I suppose that's the good thing about it, right? Is that I think not sort of as while prescription was happening, there was very much a kind of, oh, this looks like it might be implementable. We're not sure whether there's going to be enough interest in fighting back against it or not. And like I've been seeing on social media, absolute avalanche of people, and not necessarily the usual suspects either, who have been sort of merrily posting things which are quite blatantly pro-Palestine action, and then getting, in some cases, tens of thousands of people liking and reposting and commenting their own support and all the rest of it. Which it does seem a difficult thing to see how the police would enforce a consistent line of punishment when the numbers are getting that high online, certainly against people who are online, which I imagine is why they're currently ignoring them studiously. But as you say, it really depends on what the government's own position and what they tell the police that they have to do under these circumstances. I mean, without being able to tell what the police are actually saying to the government at the moment, it wouldn't surprise me if there were conversations going on in which they were saying, look, we don't have the resources to do what you're asking us to do, particularly because there are many other things which the government are trying to get the police to get involved in, the Online Safety Act we were talking about last time and all the rest of it. Like they're really asking police to stretch their resources mighty thin, covering this much ground. And I think the police themselves at one point in the last couple of weeks were saying this is a real difficulty for us, in terms of what the implementation of these laws is going to look like.
Yeah, sorry, I a bit lost you there, and it went rather quiet at my end. I
Right, sorry.
don't know about the technical.
Oh,
Sorry, but yeah, I have. I wonder if they are going to go for the more serious offence for some of the ringleaders. The Section 12 actually expressing support. That will give people the opportunity of a jury trial. it will take for a very long time unless they do a couple of key cases on the leadership. One of the founders of Palestine Action is already facing a trial for a speech they made saying, turn the Al Aqsa flood into a tsunami. In but that will that will be interesting if it happens. But at the moment, I think that because the Section 13 offence is magistrates only, or in this case, district judge and chosen district judge at Westminster, you've got no chance of getting off it. The good side being is that the penalties will be very, very minor. The obvious example is the women convicted of wearing the paragliding patch um, during an early march in Gaza, which were said that they were supporting Hamas because any paraglider was potentially representing the people on paragliders who took part in the 7th of October attack. But they got a conditional discharge. And I would expect that kind of penalty for anyone who is convicted of the Section 13.
All right. I should probably move on to our next item. Oh, actually, no. I should note that alongside the general growth in people prepared to essentially ignore the ban in Britain, there is also worth noting a new story up on the Freedom website talking about similar actions which have been taking place against Elbit. Obviously, Elbit has been the target of Palestine Action over the last few years, the Israeli arms manufacturer. And in Germany, activists have been blockading a production site in Ulm. That's well worth going and having a look at that article written by Christina Sykes. So moving on to asylum hotels. And this is talking about a rush which is currently going on to close them down because obviously they've been one of the big talking points, one of the major GB News, Daily Mail, far right social media bugbears over the last years, in which they've essentially been attempting to accelerate the number of cases which they put through the system, and essentially as soon as the asylum cases have been resolved, then people are shunted out of the hotels and onto council books instead. Oh, I think we're losing Andy there. The issue with this, as pointed out by the FT today or yesterday, is that the problem is that if you move people onto the council books, this merely deflects blame temporarily onto councils rather than onto central government, which, I mean, in terms of shifting blame, it's at best something of a temporary measure, because people are not stupid under these circumstances. But because asylum seekers are also banned from working until after their asylum claim has been processed, they are kicked out of hotels with no job and no prospects. So they are essentially rendered immediately homeless and are then picked up by councils. So this kicks the can into council's gardens, and the primary problem remains a lack of social housing available to councils, which Labour's unleashing of private sector developers has thus far and seems unlikely to do anything to fix. In terms of how we as anarchists approach this kind of thing, obviously what we're likely to be seeing if this continues apace is a shift into greater numbers of homeless people, and then from there into the usual suspects saying, look at all of these rough sleeping asylum seekers causing trouble on the streets of our major towns and cities, back to blaming Labour, back to vote reform, etc., etc. And of course, it will put an awful lot of pressure on refugee and solidarity groups. We have Andy back. I don't know how much of you heard, Andy. um, or whether you can hear me now. Possibly not as yet. The significant problem is obviously going to be resource, and in terms of what we're campaigning for, the obviously what we want to be able to see is solidarity with refugees and asylum seekers, and primarily a method to get them into the workforce which does not undermine existing workers, which allows them to join, for example, trade unions, push for the same working quality, and join the workforce in a constructive manner which doesn't give firepower to the far right, which is a huge order given the scale of the mess which has been created by the current. I struggle to call it a process, really. It's very much a kind of shifting people from pillar to post in ways which does them and, uh, you know, everyone else no good at all. Whilst Andy tries to get the audio back, I may circle back to this later, but we can move on to a related topic which could also feed into this and make it worse, which is policing ethnicity. And ethnicity. So police have, as of today, been given new guidelines encouraging them to consider disclosing the ethnicity and nationality of suspects charged in high-profile cases, which comes after they face mounting pressure over what details they make public, in which obviously the lack of detail in given cases has been used by the far right as a kind of flag for pretending, because obviously this lack of information is standard, or was standard as until today, that they were deliberately hiding ethnicity to try and deflect righteous patriotic anger, or whatever they want to call it. The idea appears to be to put responsibility onto the shoulders of top cops rather than Yvette Cooper and co being given the third degree every time over it. They will be able to say, please refer this to the head of the Met or the head of the Manchester Police or whatever. But in reality, what this does is it gives carte blanche for the likes of Farage, Tommy Robinson, Jenrick of the Tories to pick and choose their targets, and hammer away at the cases that they can find, which are, which do happen to relate to refugees or migrants of any kind, and then boost them
Yeah,
into.
sorry, can you hear me
Oh,
still,
I can
Simon?
now hear you. Yes. Can you
Oh,
hear
that's
me?
good. It's just
You put you
for
back.
viewers at home that you've been seeing a lot of my ear as I try to work out as I can hear Simon, but only very quietly. I've
Right.
had the privilege of reading the guidance from the College of Policing on this, and so what they are saying as the bluff is that it is an operational decision for the police force that they take on based on four factors. One is whether there's a policing purpose, i.e., whether it will help the investigation to release the identity. You can imagine if they're looking for witnesses, they could argue that. Then there's a question of public safety caused by misinformation. And then there's whether there has been, and here's the key one that they're looking at, is whether there's been significant public or social media interest. So as you were just pointing out, if someone like Farage or Tommy wants to stir things up, all they have to do is stir things up, and then the police will say, "Well, look, there's significant interest, and we can release it," which seems to me to be the big disgraceful point, because you can justify a open justice naming people when they're arrested, if you're going to name everyone, if you're going to release their ethnicity. or guess at it, because people, fortunately, in this country do not yet have a legal ethnicity. Something that I think that they should be reminded of occasionally, that we're not yet planning for some big clampdown on certain races. Um, and those states that had that kind of laws in the past usually it ended up very badly. Um, so yeah, once again, the cops are hiding behind their independence, and the government is hiding, but behind the police on that one. Neither will come out well from it, and the only beneficiary, of course, is is the likes of Farage, who will be able to moan still, while many potentially innocent people. And the general policy on the police releasing details is releasing details of people after they are charged. Not that they're guilty yet, but at least there are some people who get arrested, and even the police are forced to admit they've made a mistake. But there's still a lot of people who get their details released on charge that then go on to be acquitted, because other people have decided, hopefully juries, that the police have made a mistake. But yeah, bad news all round.
Yeah, and I can't see it in any way because, one of the main reasons, obviously, the government is, or one of the main justifications the government is using, is that it gets out in front of conspiracy theorists pushing particular agendas. But the problem is that this it's a continuing misunderstanding of how conspiracy theorizing works, which is not if the information is given to us that proves a thing is untrue, then we will believe that information. It's that whatever information you give, if it does not tally with the conspiracy theorist's viewpoint, it's not true and it's part of the conspiracy. Um, and it's this thing that the government still seems to think that if it just gives enough pertinent information to conspiracy theorists, the whole thing will go away. And it's like, that's not how any of this works. And I struggle to understand how supposedly cynical politicians are naive enough to think that it might. Like, this is not going to change the level of pressure that's put on you by the far right and by conspiracy theorists, or even by the likes of GB News, because that's not why they're putting the pressure on you. They're just going to find different excuses and different layerings of words to do the same thing, no matter what information you punt out there. It's very odd how incompetent at communicating this government actually is, understanding how the far right ecosystem of communication works. So, anyway, moving on. So, next one on our list is planning changes. So, this one is slightly more out of the way. So, the planning changes that the government are bringing in. This is Rachel Reeves ordering fresh planning overhaul for critical infrastructure projects. And officials are being asked to draw up proposals for a new bill that would include scaling back judicial reviews for major works. And the idea, in the broad idea, as projected by Reeves, is that the government needs to go further than even the planning and infrastructure bill that they're already presenting, which is stripping away powers from councils and from lower level planning influences. And they're just saying, right, we're actually going to scale back judicial reviews as well. The courts will have less of a say. And in theory, this is a broader thing, but the direct cause is Heathrow, which Reeves has gotten a massive bee in her bonnet about, saying she wants to see planes taking off from a new runway by 2035 as part of the agenda for growth. As to whether that will actually produce growth seems to be up in the air, but that's the basic.
The good news is that they are so incompetent that this is unlikely to be pulled off. The Labour Party, as it currently constituted is so committed to bureaucracy, inquiries, and general faffing around without doing anything, that the chances of them actually going through with this are relatively low. Also, it's going to cost a lot more money than they have, and at the moment they are completely paralysed on the buying of anything except for submarines. Now, it sort of links to our next thing on the agenda of wildfires, is that the although Ed Miliband is still pottering around the government somewhere saying that there actually is an environmental
Uh,
crisis,
poor old
everyone
Ed.
else seems to have forgotten about it. Um, and surprisingly, Heathrow is somewhat of a major symbol of what a oncoming disaster we've got all round. Um, as with if Labour had shown signs of doing well as a government and that they could guarantee a second term, then I think we'll be very, very high danger of Heathrow getting expanded. But the the all bets are off now. If you look at it from a commercial perspective, is something that you want to invest in? A project backed by the British government, you have only to look at things like HS2 and say,
Sizewell.
it ain't going to happen, son. And what happens to all our investment when there's zero profit coming out of it? So there's no private finance uh, coming. There's only one firm that I've noticed doing well at the moment, which links to our news articles, and that's Elbit, whose quarterly finance report was out the other day. The only thing that we can say that's positive from theirs is that they now have a $25 billion backlog of orders because so many countries have seen how well their stuff works at blowing people up that they've received a vast amount more than they can fulfill.
War is always good business, I suppose. But yeah, but on the Heathrow one though, I think I essentially I think you've kind of nailed it, sort of talking about the incredible difficulty that Labour seems to have in terms of actually making any of these projects happen, or getting any corporations on board. And this very much I think is collateral damage to the legal end of things, that in order to desperately try and make the project seem like a profitable enterprise, they're tearing up all kinds of laws to, you know, make this one thing look vaguely viable. But of course, those laws apply to everything. Um, so it applies to planning applications across the board, across the country. And as we know, corporations and development firms will take full advantage of this kind of thing. Governments are they are more than able to run rings around governments at the best of times, let alone when there are practically no laws in place. And it's, not to be forgotten that these laws were originally brought in because uh, the centralization process that took place throughout the 80s and 90s and 2000s was inefficient, deeply bureaucratic, uh, absolute gold mine for corruption, and they had to bring in lots of laws to get it to kind of at least attempt to balance out the problems brought on by the centralization of powers that took place throughout that time. Um, and now, we have a situation where not only will local councils and people have little to no say over major development projects which affect, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people at a time. I mean, I hail from Suffolk, and Suffolk is in the midst of, or has been for a long time, in the midst of a complete, massive redevelopment of a corridor from Felixstowe through to London and up north towards Norwich, which is turning it into a major distribution hub. And the roads have been absolutely totaled by a sudden increase, vast numbers of additional trucks, lorries, for this distribution process. Huge numbers of enormous warehouses going up, most of which are heavily automated, so they don't provide all that many jobs. None of this has been done with even a vague consultation of local people. And this is a process which, I talk about Suffolk because I kind of know a little bit about it, but it repeats across the country. And it's because centralisation and this kind of government diktat of, well, we'll wade through these major developments, just tends to happen. And the problems that this has been causing, they are now just layering another problem on top of it by saying, all right, well, all of the kind of stand-in laws that we've attempted to ameliorate the issues that we've raised here, those are going away because we want faster development, whether or not it happens, which just gives those powers instead just directly to the developers. And I can't see any good coming out of this. It's all done for that kind of boost to GDP. But as we know, GDP is a horrific way of trying to measure human satisfaction with life, and social social good for places like Suffolk and wherever else. It seems like, again, a kind of a mess layered upon a mess because they can't think of any other better way of dealing with things.
So we still agree that the Labour Party has mucked things up, and they are planning on carrying on some more muck-ups in the future. We humbly suggest that they might still do.
Well, yes, which leads us on to, in fact, our final topic for the day. We've been rattling through them, but that's no bad thing, I suppose, which is Europe, once again, is on fire. There's been serious wildfires, particularly in Spain and Greece. There's also been in Albania, I believe, serious fires, obviously in Italy. There's been some wildfires in the UK, even though, once again, cloud cover has been helping markedly with what would have otherwise been the same horrific heat wave, which has hit most of Europe, 41 degrees in France, for example. Obviously, these are brought on in part by exactly the things that we've been talking about with the previous items, including the expansion of Heathrow against every climate change metric, the planning changes in general that we've been talking about. There's a consistent problem. So this is something which I think I might write about later, but it connects to, for example, obviously it connects to the migration crisis because people are now increasingly moving to Europe to escape it, but also it connects to there is a fundamental flaw emerging in capitalism, which you can identify by the fact that both for wind power and solar power, they are becoming financially unviable because they are too cheap in summer. So famously, wind power is being attacked by Reform, saying we're having to subsidize wind farms for being turned off because we don't need the power at this particular moment. And therefore, they are costing us money rather than saving us money. And solar in Spain is now so cheap that the companies are struggling to justify their business model. Now, the idea that energy should be so cheap that it is practically free should, under any sane system, be considered an incredible victory. And for capitalism, by capitalists, in theory, this should be an incredible proof positive that capitalism can create more energy than it needs. And yet, what it actually produces is crisis flat out crisis. So that free energy, which is not destroying the planet, is suddenly a problem, even as wildfires are burning down half of southern Europe. I mean, what an incredible situation.
It is, yeah, the whole climate crisis. We knew about it. We in the collective global human community knew about it in time to solve it. The resources were there to prevent it going beyond 1 degree, let alone 1.5. Capitalism faffed, and now when capitalism is in the position where it could at least stop it getting further, they are not going to pull the plug on fossil fuels, which are continuing to be dug up at greater rates than ever before, because the international competition about those elements does not allow that to happen. That's in part why Trump is somewhat of an exception. You couldn't have predicted someone that insane becoming president of the United States in advance if you were looking at the prospects for climate change 50 years ago, when people first were aware that it was going to be a problem. Um, but it's those things in capitalism, the inability to look at the long term beyond the next election or beyond when the company director retires, that are inherent flaws. And we have been lucky with other things. You think about the ozone layer. If we'd gone with different chemicals in the as propellants for aerosols, then that ozone layer could have been fatal worldwide. And climate change is, if you like, just one example of the failures, and the more technologically advanced we become, the more danger is there of other things uh, in the pipeline. The obvious ones that are coming is not enough being done about preventable diseases. We've had a scare with COVID, but luckily it was not as bad as it could have been. But there is this, if you like, media a gap of what's interesting for the moment, and then it has to be dropped because to make way for something else. And unfortunately, climate change seems to have run out of steam as a popular issue, just as it gets worse by the moment. And those wildfires, like someone once said to me about wildfires, you should see them. They're spreading like wildfire because people do not quite get the connection between what is actually happening here and now, and why we've said that is the problem all along.
Yeah. No, it's it's in many ways it's an incredible vindication of the climate change movement over the last 30 years, but it's also, it's it really has highlighted the difficulties which we faced in terms of, so what's his name, Peter Gelderloos was, I sort of I was listening to him talking about the fundamental problem of capitalism's inability to envisage or fix any of this, because obviously in a straightforward economic basis we've got their ideological um, commitment to GDP growth, and GDP growth cannot uh, coexist with the degrowth necessary to cut emissions. This is actually fairly broadly mainstream understanding now. I remember it also showing up on Frankie Boyle's show. a couple of years ago, in which, people were saying, yeah, obviously, like if you demand 1 or 2% growth every year, then you're going to need to find energy that for that. You're going to need to find investment and production of concrete and all the rest of it. And that's going to add to what already exists. You can't have infinite growth on a finite planet. But this is said, and then it's flat out ignored. Um, and as commenter notes, addressing animal agriculture in terms of climate emissions, pollution, deforestation, etc., as well, which is absolutely true. There is the just absolute fact that changing food production standards. So, for example, China is moving to a much more meat-heavy um, eating habit to essentially bring it into line with uh, much of the West. And rather than the West saying, "Oh God, there's increasing pressure there, which we're going to have to deal with on a finite planet, in which most of the land available is already being cultivated to a great degree." There's just a kind of sweeping under the rug of it and saying, well, the market will sort it. And as well, no, the market will just try and produce to demand. And if demand is rising, the market will um, continue to increase production until it can't anymore. And that increased production, that end of increasing production will essentially be will be systems collapse. I mean, that's the bottom line, right? Is that it will continue to produce to its maximum extent until systems can't uh, maintain that anymore, and then you have a sudden, massive collapse, which capitalism will no doubt blame on migrants or the left or someone other than the system which is producing it, and which we can bang on about here and have done for 20, 30 years, etc.
Well, yeah, I'm with you there. Actually, that capitalism is a really bad thing. I wish I'd known how bad it was some time ago. There should be some movement against it. That's what I reckon.
Yeah, sounds like maybe a good idea. Um, but there is, it's a thing which, whenever you're kind of listening to the Green Party or even kind of the kind of but supposedly radical groups like the Communist Party or Socialist Party or the RCP or whatever, is that they all still talk in kind of mitigatory terms, right? Like an accommodation with capitalism that allows it to kind of gently shift into a more socialistic model, maybe down the social democratic route like Scandinavia or Switzerland or something along those lines. I'm just looking at it going, like those countries are not sustaining either. Like Norway and Sweden and all the rest of it, their models are based on an accommodation with existing capitalism. In at least one case, selling the oil which capitalism burns, right? Like they're not sort of somehow um, off somewhere else in which they are completely blameless and unconnected, and that social democratic model is going to save the day. Like they are not radical enough models, and they can't be. And a slow conversion to them is as delusional as do nothing, stick your head in the sand, or oh, we'll just kind of build flood defenses, I guess, when the waters start to rise. Um, there's no concept, even from the revolutionary or semi-revolutionary or pseudo-revolutionary organizations, that what they're calling for is impractical, straightforwardly an impractical position to have, given the challenges that we face. Yeah. So if you're just a straightforward little less socialist, then maybe you should be rethinking your position. Um, right. On which note, I think we are now pretty much out of topics. So thank you very much for the uh, multitude of you who are watching. And thank you, Andy, for your patience and listening to me waffle on, and indeed your wise responses. And we shall see you all next time. Cheerio for now.